I could hear my father's voice through the chapel doors, telling everyone my marriage was a mistake. The doors were closed, but not enough to block his voice. I stood there in my wedding dress, listening as my father spoke into a microphone, not to bless the marriage, but to warn everyone in the room that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. 200 guests, family, friends, strangers, all hearing him say I was choosing the wrong man, that I'd spend my life living in another woman's shadow. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. And then, something shifted. Because while everyone was focused on him, one small figure stood up from the front row, 7 years old, wearing a suit just a little too big, and in his hands was a piece of paper no one had seen before. What happened next silenced the entire room. My name is Maya, and I am 29 years old. I grew up in a house where love was given in conditions. Like a contract with fine print, no one showed you until you violated, a clause you didn't know existed. My father, Gerald, was the kind of man who commanded rooms, not because he was loud, though he could be, but because people believed he was righteous. He stood at the front of our small chapel every Sunday for 22 years, hands gripping the edges of the pulpit, like he was holding the whole congregation steady. My mother, Ruth, sat in the front pew every single week, smiling the way people smile in photographs, perfectly arranged, perfectly still. I loved them both for a long time before I understood that their love came with a map, and any road I took that wasn't on it would be treated like trespassing. I was their only daughter. That meant I carried something for them, a version of themselves they wanted, the world to see, obedient, grateful, predictable. For most of my 20s, I gave them that, until Caleb. I met Caleb on an ordinary Tuesday in March. I was a third-grade teacher, and the school had paired each classroom with a parent volunteer for reading week. Caleb walked in wearing a slightly wrinkled button-down and carrying a picture book upside down. He didn't notice until one of my students pointed it out. He laughed at himself immediately, without embarrassment, and that laugh cracked something open in me before he'd even said hello. He had a son named Noah, 7 years old. Curly hair, serious eyes, the kind of kid who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything. Caleb had been widowed 3 years before we met. His wife, Diane, had passed from an illness that moved faster than anyone expected. He never spoke about it to make people feel sorry for him. He mentioned it the way you mention weather, matter of fact, already integrated into who he was. That honesty was the first thing I fell in love with. The second was the way he looked at Noah, like the boy was the most important thing he'd ever been trusted with. We dated quietly for 8 months before I told my parents. I should have known from the way my mother went silent on the phone that the conversation wasn't over. It had only been paused. The dinner where I introduced Caleb to my parents lasted exactly 47 minutes. I know because I watched the clock above the fireplace the entire time, counting down from the moment my father shook Caleb's hand without smiling. My father asked Caleb questions that sounded polite but weren't. What happened to your wife? How long ago? And the boy, does he still ask about her? Are you finished grieving? Caleb answered each one with a patience I still don't fully understand. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't cold. He just told the truth calmly, like a man who had already made peace with things my father had never had to face. After Caleb left, my father sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands folded. He said Caleb was a good man, probably. But that word, but, sitting in the middle of the sentence like a wall. He said I was taking on another woman's life. Her house, her child, her memories. He said I would spend my entire marriage competing with someone who was no longer there to lose. He said grief doesn't disappear. It relocates. My mother added, softer but equally certain, that she just wanted me to be someone's first choice. I told them I was his first choice. That was why he'd asked me to marry him. They didn't answer that. They just looked at each other the way people do when they've already decided the conversation is over. Caleb and I got engaged 6 months later. I told my parents over the phone because I didn't trust myself to stay calm in person. My father listened, said he needed time to think, and then didn't call back for 11 days. When he finally did, his voice was measured. He said they would come to the wedding. He said they wanted to support me. He said they had prayed about it and were choosing to be present. I believed him. I want to be clear about that. I believed him completely. I spent the next 4 months planning a wedding with a mother who asked questions but offered no opinions and a father who nodded but never looked quite at ease. I told myself it was adjustment. I told myself they were trying. Caleb told me to trust what I saw, not what I hoped. I wish I had listened more carefully to that. The morning of the wedding, everything felt surreal in the way that enormous days always do. Like the world had shifted slightly to the left, and you're walking through it half a step behind yourself. Noah had stayed with Caleb's sister the night before, but he arrived at the chapel early, dressed in a small navy suit that was slightly too big in the shoulders, hair combed flat in a way that clearly hadn't survived the car ride. He ran to me when he saw me, and stopped just short of hugging me, suddenly shy in a way he almost never was. I bent down and told him he looked like a very serious businessman. He told me I looked like someone in a movie. I laughed and my whole chest loosened. My parents arrived 20 minutes later. My mother hugged me. My father kissed my forehead. Everything felt, for one fragile moment, like I had been wrong to worry. Like the last several months of tension had just been the growing pains of a family adjusting to change. Then my maid of honor, Priya, appeared at my side with a look I had never seen on her face before. Controlled fear, she pulled me away from the main hall and into the small room where I'd been getting ready. She closed the door and kept her voice very quiet. She told me my father had spoken to Pastor Henderson before the ceremony began. She told me he had asked for a few minutes at the pulpit. She told me he had already taken it. The sound system in that chapel carries further than most people realize. My father's voice traveled through the corridor, through the door, and reached me with perfect, terrible clarity. He spoke about love. He spoke about family. He spoke about the responsibilities we carry when we enter into sacred commitments. Then he said my name. He said he loved me more than I would ever understand. And then he told the congregation, 200 people who had watched me grow up, who had brought casseroles to our house when I was sick, who had clapped at my high school graduation, that he was worried. He said Caleb was a decent man, probably. That word again, in the same place. He said that I was a young woman taking on a burden I didn't fully understand, that Noah was not my child and would never fully be, that Caleb's grief was a third presence in any marriage I entered, invisible but permanent. He said he had tried to counsel me privately and I had not listened. He asked the congregation to pray for my clarity. He asked them to pray for my wisdom. He said sometimes the people who love us most have to say the hard things out loud. Then he stepped back from the pulpit. In the corridor, I stood completely still. Priya had her hand on my arm. I couldn't feel it. Here is what I want to tell you about that moment, because it matters. I didn't cry. I had expected to fall apart if something like this ever happened. I had played versions of this scenario in my head. During the anxious hours between midnight and 3 a.m, I had imagined myself collapsing, running, dissolving into something unrecognizable. Instead, I felt strangely clear. Not numb, clear. Like every single thing that had been blurry for the past year had suddenly come into focus. My parents had come to my wedding, but they had not come to celebrate it. They had come because they believed that public pressure, the weight of 200 watching eyes, was the last tool they hadn't used yet. They had tried private conversation. They had tried silence. They had tried cool, polite distance, and none of it had changed my mind. So they had reached for the loudest option available. They had asked a congregation to be their leverage. I want to tell you what I saw when Priya opened that corridor door. Through the small crack, I could see the side of the chapel. I could see guests shifting in their seats. Some were looking at their hands. Some were looking toward the front where my father had stood. A few were looking toward the back, toward the door I hadn't walked through yet. And then I saw Noah. He was sitting in the second row on the left, next to Caleb's sister. He hadn't been part of the wedding party. He'd wanted to watch from the seats, which was so entirely him that we'd said yes immediately. He had his hands folded in his lap. He was watching the door where I was supposed to enter. Not nervously, not with the fidgeting of a child who didn't understand what was happening. Just waiting. With a steadiness that made no sense for a 7-year-old. Something inside me rebuilt itself in about 4 seconds. Priya asked me what I wanted to do. I asked her to fix the pearl button on my wrist. She did. I picked up my bouquet, and I nodded toward the door. The music began. I walked through those chapel doors, and the first thing I heard was the shift in the room. That collective inhale. 200 people recalibrating in real time, unsure what my face was going to show them, unsure what version of this story they were about to witness. My father was already seated, my mother beside him, hands in her lap, eyes forward. I did not look at them. I looked at Caleb. He was standing at the altar in a charcoal suit, and when he saw me, something moved across his face that I cannot fully name. Relief and grief and gratitude and love all at once, pressed together into an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. His eyes were red. He had heard everything, too. I walked halfway down the aisle before I noticed Noah had stood up. He had slipped out of his seat quietly, without asking permission. Caleb's sister reached for him, but he was already moving, walking to the edge of the aisle with something in his hands, a piece of paper, folded in half. No one knew about the paper, not me. Not Caleb, not Priya. He had brought it himself, tucked into the inside pocket of that too-big suit jacket, and he held it now with both hands, looking at me with those serious eyes. Waiting, I stopped walking. The music kept playing for a confused moment before it faded. The entire chapel went absolutely silent. Noah unfolded the paper slowly. His hands were steady. His face was calm. He held it up so I could see it first. 4 words, written in thick marker, in the printing of a child who had recently learned that letters could carry meaning beyond their shape. You are my family. I don't have words for what happened in my chest in that moment. There isn't vocabulary for it. Something cracked open that had been sealed shut, and everything I had been holding together since the corridor. The clarity, the steadiness, the careful composure broke apart completely, but not into sadness, into something else entirely. The woman beside me in the 3rd row started crying first, then someone behind her, then to the left, near the windows. I heard a sound I had only ever heard before at funerals and homecomings, that kind of crying that has no performance in it, that comes from somewhere involuntary. My father did not move. My mother pressed 2 fingers to her lips. Noah was still holding up the sign, watching me with the patience of someone 3 times his age. I walked the rest of the aisle in tears, and when I reached the altar, Noah folded the paper carefully and tucked it back into his jacket pocket. Like it was done. Like it had said exactly what it needed to say. Caleb took my hand, and I remembered something he had told me very early on, in one of those late-night conversations when you learn whether someone is built from the same material you are. He had said, Noah doesn't give his trust easily, but when he does, he doesn't take it back. The ceremony continued, but the room had changed. I could feel it in the quality of the attention. Before the ceremony, the air had been thick with discomfort and divided loyalty. Now it was something else, something quieter and more honest. When the pastor spoke, he chose words I had not heard him use before, about chosen family, about the courage it takes to love what has already been broken, about how sometimes the people who know the least about our lives feel the most qualified to speak, about them. He did not look at my father when he said it, but several other people did. Afterward, at the reception, a man I barely knew, a friend of Caleb's from years back, came and found me at the edge of the room. He was older, maybe 60, with the hands of someone who had worked outside his whole life. He said he had lost his wife 17 years ago. He said he had remarried and spent the first 3 years waiting for his new wife to leave because everyone around them had told her she was making a mistake. He said she never left. He said watching the ceremony today made him want to call her and tell her again. He walked away before I could answer. I didn't speak to my parents that evening. They had come to the reception and sat at their assigned table and eaten their dinner in the careful, quiet way of people who have realized the room is no longer on their side. My father shook Caleb's hand again, this time briefly, without words. My mother hugged me goodbye at the end of the night with a tightness that felt different from the morning's hug, like something had been rearranged. A guest had filmed part of the ceremony on their phone. I didn't know it until later. I didn't know that Noah's moment had been captured from the side angle, clear enough to read the sign, clear enough to see Caleb's face when he saw it. I didn't know that by the time we reached our hotel that night, someone had already uploaded it. I didn't know that while Caleb and I sat on the edge of the bed, too exhausted to fully speak, eating crackers from the gift basket because we'd barely touched our dinner, the video was already moving. 3 days later, my phone stopped functioning as a phone. The notifications had overwhelmed everything else. I sat on the balcony of the place we'd rented for the week, reading messages from strangers while Caleb slept and the morning was still pale and cool. A woman who had married a widower 12 years ago and spent a decade proving herself to his family. A man whose second wife had walked away because the pressure became too much. Stepchildren who had written their own versions of what Noah had written, in words and gestures and choices, but had never been seen the way he was seen. The video had reached millions of views before the week was out. Headlines were being written that I hadn't been asked about. And somewhere, in the house I grew up in, my parents were reading those same headlines. I didn't know yet what that would change. I didn't know yet what my father would say when he finally called. His voice carrying a weight I had never heard in it before. I didn't know what my mother had been thinking in the silence of those 3 days, or what she had written in the journal she kept on the nightstand. I didn't know if the thing that had cracked open in that chapel was the beginning of a wound or the beginning of healing. What I knew was this. Noah had folded that paper and put it back in his pocket like it was a finished thing. But for me, for Caleb, for the people watching from every corner of the world, it felt like the very beginning of something, and I wasn't sure yet whether I was ready for what came next. The first hint came from a change no one could quite explain. Something felt slightly out of place, even if everything looked the same. That feeling didn't go away. It grew stronger with each passing moment. People began to notice what they had once overlooked, and that quiet realization slowly changed how everything was understood. Part 2. The folded paper. Context bridge. Noah had tucked the paper back into his jacket pocket. The video was spreading. My parents were somewhere reading headlines about their own daughter's wedding, and I was sitting on a balcony, not yet knowing what any of it would cost or give back. The call came on a Thursday morning. Not from my father, from my mother. That alone told me something had shifted. In our family, my father made the phone calls. He set the tone, established the agenda, arrived at conclusions before the conversation began. My mother translated afterward, softening edges, filling silences. The fact that she was calling first, without him, meant something I couldn't yet name. I let it ring twice before I answered. Her voice was quieter than I expected. Not fragile, quiet in the way of someone who has been sitting with a thought long enough that speaking it out loud feels almost secondary. She said she had watched the video. I waited. She said she had watched it 17 times. I didn't know what to do with that number. 17. Not once. Looking for context. Not twice, making sure she understood it. 17 times. Which meant she had sat somewhere, alone in that house and pressed play again and again, watching her grandson, she hadn't yet accepted, hold up 4 words to the daughter she had, helped shame from a pulpit 4 days earlier. I asked her what she was thinking when she watched it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she kept watching Noah's face. She said she wasn't watching me, or Caleb, or the congregation's reaction. She was watching Noah, the way he stood, the way he held the paper steady, the way he looked at me not with desperation, not with the pleading expression of a child who needed something, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already decided. She said she didn't understand how a 7-year-old could be that sure. I told her that was exactly why I was marrying his father. Another silence. Longer this time. She didn't apologize on that call. I want to be honest about that because this story isn't about a tidy resolution that arrived on schedule. She didn't apologize, and neither did my father, not that day. What she did was something I hadn't expected and couldn't have prepared for. She asked if she could meet Noah. Not Caleb, not me and Caleb together. Not a formal reconciliation dinner with assigned seats and careful conversation. Just Noah. She asked if she could take him somewhere simple, a park or an ice cream place, somewhere a child would feel at ease and just meet him. I told her I needed to talk to Caleb first. She said of course. She said she'd wait as long as it took. Caleb's first response wasn't anger. That surprised me a little, though it probably shouldn't have. Caleb processed things inward before he let them surface, which meant by the time he spoke, he had usually already moved through the part that could have been destructive. He sat with the question for about 20 minutes. We were in the kitchen, and he stood at the counter the way he did when he was thinking, one hand flat on the surface, looking at nothing specific. Then he asked me one question. He asked if I thought she meant it. I told him I thought she was trying to. He said that might be enough to start with. We arranged it for the following Saturday. A small park 20 minutes from our apartment, the kind with a duck pond and a gravel path and wooden benches that had been there, long enough to feel permanent. Caleb brought Noah and stayed on a bench near the entrance while my mother and I walked with Noah toward the water. Noah had been told simply that this was my mom, that she wanted to say hello, and that he didn't have to do or say anything he didn't want to. He had nodded with that familiar seriousness and asked if the ducks would bite. Caleb told him probably not if he didn't get too close. Noah decided that was a reasonable risk. My mother had brought bread for the ducks. An entire small loaf, slightly stale the way you're supposed to bring it. Noah noticed immediately. He looked at the bag in her hand, then up at her face, and something in his assessment visibly shifted, like she had passed a preliminary test he hadn't announced. They walked along the path together, slightly ahead of me. Tossing pieces of bread toward the water's edge, she asked him questions the way you ask a child questions when you're genuinely curious, rather than performing interest. What grade was he in? Did he like his teacher? What was the best thing about second grade so far? He told her the best thing was the classroom library because it had a whole shelf of books about weather, and he was currently very interested in how tornadoes formed. My mother, who had grown up in a part of the country where severe weather was a genuine seasonal presence, told him she had once seen a funnel cloud form over a field when she was about his age. Noah stopped walking. He looked at her with an expression I can only describe as professional respect. He asked her everything. I sat on the bench beside Caleb and watched them from a distance. My mother, who was 61 years old and had spent the last several months convinced I was making the worst decision of my life, was now crouched slightly at the edge of a duck pond, describing the color of a funnel cloud to a 7-year-old who was listening with his entire body. Caleb didn't say anything for a while. Then he said quietly that he hadn't expected this. I told him I hadn't either. He said he wasn't sure what it meant yet. I said I wasn't either, but we both kept watching, because something was happening in real time that neither of us had scripted, and those moments, the unscripted ones, are the only ones that ever actually count. My father called 2 weeks later. I had started to wonder if he wouldn't. If the public nature of the video, the comment sections he could not control, the headlines he had not anticipated, would cause him to retreat further rather than reach forward. Some people, when they realize the world has seen them clearly, go smaller, build higher walls, decide that the problem was exposure rather than action. But my father called, and his voice was different, not broken. He wasn't a man who broke easily, and I wouldn't have known what to do with that version of him anyway. But the quality of authority was gone. That particular tone, the one that had lived in every difficult conversation we'd had for the last 2 years, the tone that assumed conclusion before discussion, that assumed his certainty outweighed my experience. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something rawer, something that sounded underneath the careful phrasing like a man who had been genuinely surprised by himself. He said he had read the comments. I almost said something deflecting, some version of "you don't have to explain," but I stopped myself because he did have to explain, not for my satisfaction, but because the explanation was part of something he needed to complete, and interrupting it would have been its own kind of unkindness. He said he had read thousands of comments, from widowers who said their second marriages had saved them, from stepchildren, who said they had spent years feeling like they were the reason their parents' new partner eventually left, from women who said they had walked away from the right person because their families had applied exactly the kind of pressure he had applied, and they had spent years regretting it. He said he had not understood before that the full weight of what he was asking me to walk away from. Not just a man, not just a marriage. A child who had written 4 words on a piece of paper and walked down an aisle alone, at 7 years old, because he had decided I was worth claiming publicly. My father said he had not, until that moment, thought about it from Noah's side. I stayed quiet. He said that was the thing that had stayed with him. Not the public reaction, not the headlines, but the specific image of a 7-year-old boy who had lost his mother, and who had decided on his own, without being asked, that I was family. He said he didn't know how to have dismissed that without even knowing it. I'm not going to tell you that conversation fixed everything, because it didn't. Repair doesn't work that way. And if I told you it did, I would be giving you a version of this story that felt satisfying but wasn't true. What I will tell you is that it was the first conversation my father and I had ever had where he talked more than he concluded, where he asked more than he declared, where he sat in the uncomfortable space of not knowing the answer instead of arriving with one prepackaged. That was new, and new in families like mine is its own kind of miracle. Caleb and I had my parents over for dinner 6 weeks after the wedding. I spent 2 days anxious about it in the specific way of someone who has learned not to overtrust hope but can't quite stop hoping anyway. I rearranged the table centerpiece 4 times. I asked Caleb if the lighting was too dim, and he said the lighting was fine, and I asked again an hour later. He told me that whatever happened, We had already proven we didn't need their approval to be okay. He was right. But I still wanted the dinner to go well. Noah set the table. He had asked if he could, completely unprompted, and we had said yes. He arranged the forks on the wrong side and didn't notice. And I didn't correct him, because the effort was more important than the geometry. When my parents arrived, my mother brought flowers. My father brought a book about weather systems that he had found at a second-hand shop, thick and slightly worn, with detailed photographs of storm formations. He gave it to Noah directly, didn't hand it to me or Caleb to pass along, looked at Noah, held it out, and said he'd heard someone at this address was interested in tornadoes. Noah looked at the book, then at my father, then at the book again. Then he said thank you in the deliberate way of someone who means it completely. My father nodded once, short, like a punctuation mark. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't the kind of moment that would go viral. There was no audience, no music cue, no congregation watching to see what would happen next. It was just an old man and a small boy, standing in a hallway, reaching toward each other across a distance that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Dinner was imperfect in all the ordinary ways. My father said something about the way Caleb had cooked the chicken that was technically a compliment, but phrased like an observation, and I saw Caleb register it and decide to let it go. My mother talked too much about a neighbor I didn't know, and not enough about the things that actually mattered. There was a silence after dessert that stretched, about 30 seconds too long before Noah rescued it by asking my father which was scarier, a tornado or a hurricane, and my father launched into an answer with more genuine enthusiasm than I had heard from him in years. After they left, Caleb and I cleaned the kitchen together. He said it was a start. I said it was more than I expected. He said that was probably the right level of expectation. The video never fully stopped circulating. Even months later, it surfaced in new places. Different platforms, different audiences, different corners of the internet where people were having conversations about blended families, about grief, about the particular cruelty of public shame dressed up as concern. Strangers continued to write to me. A woman whose in-laws had spent 3 years making her feel like an understudy in her own marriage. A man who had raised his partner's daughter from infancy and been told by her grandparents that he would never be real family. A teenager who had printed out a screenshot of Noah's sign and taped it to the inside of her locker because her own family had told her something she needed to survive. I read every message, not because I had answers for any of them, but because Noah had done something on that day that I was still learning to fully understand. He had taken a private truth, the thing he felt, the thing he knew, the quiet daily reality of a child who had decided to trust, again after losing everything, and he had made it visible, not for applause, not for the camera he didn't know was there, but because he believed the moment required honesty, and he was 7 years old and already braver than most adults I knew. I asked him about it once, about the sign. We were in the car, driving back from his soccer practice, and he was eating crackers from a small bag and looking out the window, and I asked him when he had decided to make it. He thought about it for a moment. He said he made it the night before the wedding. He said he had been thinking about what the wedding meant, and he knew there had been some kind of problem. He hadn't understood the specifics, but children always understand more than we think, and he wanted to do something. I asked him how he decided what to write. He said it was just what was true, like it was simple, like the only question was which truth to make visible. And once you knew the answer, the rest was just marker on paper. I think about that a lot. Not just the words, but the logic underneath them. The idea that the most powerful thing you can offer in a room full of complicated adult feelings and competing agendas and inherited fears is just the simple, uncomplicated truth. My father had stood at a pulpit with a microphone and the authority of 22 years of Sundays behind him and tried to shape the narrative of my life using doubt and public pressure and the weight of other people's eyes. And a 7-year-old had answered him with 4 words written in marker, and 4 words had won. My parents are not perfect. I don't need them to be. We have dinner together roughly once a month now. My father and Noah have a running conversation about meteorological events that has developed its own vocabulary and inside references that I only half understand. My mother brings things, food, flowers, a book she thought I'd like, small objects that say the things she hasn't yet found words for. We are not the family we might have been if none of this had happened. We are something more complicated and I think more real, Caleb told me recently. On an evening when Noah had gone to bed early and we were sitting outside in the quiet, that he used to worry the past would always feel like a presence in our marriage. Not Diane herself, but the shape of the loss, the before and after of it, the way grief restructures a person so thoroughly that even the rebuilt version still shows the seams. He said he didn't feel that way anymore. I asked him what had changed. He said Noah had stopped grieving his mother as a loss and started holding her as a memory, and that there was a difference. That grief as loss is a wound that keeps reopening, but grief as memory is something you carry, not something that carries you. He said he thought Noah had started making that shift around the time he wrote the sign, like he had found a way to say, "She was mine, and she is gone, and I am still here, and I am still choosing. I still have the paper." Noah gave it to me on a regular morning, about 3 months after the wedding, handed it across the breakfast table the way you'd pass the orange juice, without ceremony or announcement. He said he thought I should keep it. I asked him if he was sure. He said he had already remembered it, so he didn't need it anymore. I kept it in the small drawer of my nightstand for a long time. Sometimes I would open the drawer late at night, not to look at it, just to know it was there. That piece of paper that had moved through a silent chapel and reached 11 million strangers and somehow eventually found its way into a secondhand weather, book and a monthly dinner and a "father's changed" voice on a Thursday morning phone call. 4 words, written by a child who had learned the hardest lesson life can teach. You before most people learn to ride a bike. That love doesn't guarantee you against loss, but it is still always worth choosing. If this story reached something in you today, if you've ever been told that the love you chose was the wrong kind, or that the family you were building wasn't legitimate, or that the past disqualified you from a future, then I want you to know something. You are not the only one. And sometimes the truest thing in the room is the one nobody expected to speak. When everything was finally left behind, what remained was unexpectedly simple. Not answers, not conclusions, but a shift in how things were understood. The moments that once felt uncertain no longer held the same weight. They became part of a larger picture that only time could reveal. There was no need to revisit every detail. What mattered had already taken its place. In the end, it wasn't about closing the story perfectly. It was about recognizing how it changed the perspective moving forward. Because some experiences don't need resolution to have meaning. They simply need to be understood. And once they are, everything else begins to fall into place in its own way. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because every week, there is someone out there who needs to remember they are not alone.